Okay, well, looks like it's just me this week. Alright, Nurse Cartoon Face Disembody, you knew this was always going to be a possibility. Deep breaths. After Down and Dirty Duck, you learned some things about being in charge. Besides, it's not like it's the end of the world, right?
Well, it's funny you should say that, Nurse.
Oh my god.
Let's talk about post-apocalyptic movies, shall we?
What are you wearing?
Oh, this? Get used to it, Nurse. This is how we're all going to dress when the apocalypse hits.
And when is that apocalypse going to hit?
I mean, honestly, it's going to be here any minute now. That's right, it's always looming.
Oh, is it now?
Sure is. And if it wasn't ever looming in the real world, films, TV, books, and all sorts of other media sure would take advantage of the fears that were born into each and every one of us. Sometimes movies were about what led to society falling apart. Often it would be the immediate aftermath. However, this week's movie, Warrior of the Lost World, is kind of a post-apocalyptic movie that is set in a time long after what caused the apocalypse. The aftermath of society crumbling to nothing and the rise of a whole new society. Now, this movie was an Italian-American co-production, and once this movie starts, I think you can look at what I just said about that being a co-production and Italy's involvement and say, yeah, no shit. But while it was obviously heavily inspired by a far more popular loner who travels on the road and warring his way through a new society, the film was directed by American David Worth. Now, most of Worth's career in film came as a cinematographer. It's also where the majority of his best-known works came from. In the early part of the 80s, he worked as the director of photography for a couple of Clint Eastwood films, Bronco Billy and Any Which Way You Can.
Is that second one the one with the monkey, or is that Bronco Billy? Wait, why would you name an orangutan Bronco Billy?
Wait, Any Which Way You Can is the sequel to Every Which Way But Loose, which featured Clint palling around with Clyde, the orangutan.
There are two movies with Clint Eastwood and an orangutan?
There sure is.
That seems both excessive and not nearly enough.
Yeah, it sure does. But anyway, in addition to those two films, Worth also worked as DP for two interesting late 80s action films. The first was Never Too Young to Die, which featured John Stamos pre-Full House, and an evil cross-dressing Gene Simmons. But 1988 brought to him Bloodsport, which propelled Jean-Claude Van Damme into superstardom. The following year, Worth directed his most popular film, Kickboxer, also starring JCVD. As the 90s came, Worth directed two Lady Dragon films starring Cynthia Rothrock.
I wish I had a kick-ass nickname like Lady Dragon, or a cool real name like Cynthia Rothrock.
Well, how about something like Madam Death Punch?
That's too kick-ass. Let's dial it back a little.
Well, let's workshop it, okay? Because I think we're gonna need cool names to survive the apocalypse.
Agreed.
Now, one of the supporting cast members in 1992's Lady Dragon is the lead of this film, Robert Ginty. Now, Ginty is kind of an interesting actor. For the most part, he's really best known for having a fairly popular recurring role as Thomas Anderson on The Paper Chase. The same year in which he first appeared on that show, he also had a supporting role in the Oscar-winning Vietnam vet drama Coming Home. He appeared in a lot of TV shows in the 70s. While he only appeared in a few films, back at least in that decade, those were mostly well-liked too. However, in the 80s, Ginty would have most of his lead roles, but none of them were exceptionally well-liked by audiences or critics. In fact, a lot of them were exploitation-level action films like The Exterminator and The Exterminator 2 from Cannon Films. And he was in the inexplicably incest-laced heist film White Fire as well. That's a weird one, too. But it's not like he didn't have the rugged looks of a leading man, particularly in the action genre. However, one of the things that was almost picked on in terms of his acting abilities is his mostly emotionless and flatline delivery. He was never terribly charismatic as an actor. This has been riffed about him by everyone from Mystery Science Theater 3000 to Red Letter Media. In fact, MST3K, when watching this specific film, had Joel do a skit where he talked like Ginty had marbles in his mouth or something packed into his jowls. Part of this was likely because his background was actually as a musician. In his teen years, he was a drummer and ultimately ended up getting opportunities to play with greats like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Carlos Santana, and John Lee Hooker.
So, are you saying he had trouble drumming up charisma on screen?
Yes, I am. Anyway, let's get into this movie. We've got a couple more recognizable faces that we can discuss in the next break. But for now, nurse, get yourself a machine gun, get a headband, grab a black tank top or something probably, maybe some camo pants and, a pair of army boots. And let's find ourselves either a really cool motorcycle or a bitchin' car with, like spikes or something sticking out of it.
I don't think I'll be doing any of that, but I will think about what cool name I want to have. I feel like the rider's motorcycle is the post-apocalyptic version of Poop Shoot.
Ooh, I like that. We could make a car or a motorcycle and put Poop Shoot onto a little screen to talk to us and warn us of bad guys and bad movies in the post-apocalypse. Yeah, just like that. But there's no trouble right now. But you know what? Keep up the good work nonetheless.
Jeff, how will a motorcycle work for us in the post-apocalypse?
Oh, that's easy. We'll have a sidecar.
Awesome. I'll drive, you get in the sidecar.
I actually, yeah. I've always wanted to ride in a sidecar.
Right? See? I know you better than you know.
I suppose so, but just don't drive tits first into the side of a cliff. But you want to talk about some of the other recognizable people in this?
Let's do it.
So we talked about Ginty already. He plays the writer. The next recognizable face we have to meet is someone whose name we actually don't, to my knowledge, ever get because he's only ever listed as henchman in the cast, and he's played by Fred Williamson. Now, Williamson is kind of a legendary badass. He was born in Gary, Indiana in 1938. His first claim to fame was as a football player. He played college ball at nearby Northwestern in Chicago. He later found his way as an undrafted free agent in the NFL playing for the San Francisco 49ers. There, when the coaches noticed that he played with a little too much intensity and aggression, he gained the nickname The Hammer. He didn't play in the NFL very long before going to the American Football League, where he really made his mark as a player. He played for multiple seasons with the Oakland Raiders and then with the Kansas City Chiefs. Williamson would play in Super Bowl I for the Chiefs against the Green Bay Packers. He made headlines by saying he would knock the Packers wide receivers out of the game. After all, he was the Hammer. However, in the fourth quarter, he himself was knocked out of the game, much to the gleeful jesting of the Packers players. But after his football career ended in 1967, Williamson became an actor, and this was his real claim to fame. Sure, he played football. Sure, he had a nickname. Sure, he played in Super Bowl I. However, he became a pretty big blaxploitation star, which also led to several other movie roles. He starred in a few movies with titles I better never utter because of the use of a certain word, but regardless of those titles, he either wrote, directed, or starred in them, and they would be kind of important blaxploitation westerns. Without a doubt, movies like Black Caesar, Hell Up in Harlem, and Mean Johnny Borrows proved to solidify him as a key figure in black cinema in the 70s. By the way, all three of those movies are actually quite good, especially, and also the ones with the titles I can't really repeat. But his nearly 60-year career is still going strong as he has movies in the pipeline.
Now see, the Hammer, nice, simple, to the point, he'll hammer ya. Kind of like the Rider.
Yeah, now that brings up a point that I want to make. The names of the characters in this movie are kind of bizarre. Sure, the Rider makes sense. He's mysterious. He's a loner. He doesn't let anyone but his talking motorcycle into his life.
He's like Mad Max. Say, this movie sure does seem like it wants to be a Mad Max movie.
Oh yeah, this movie's 1,000% inspired by the Mad Max movies, the Road Warrior in particular.
Ooh, I think I want my post-apocalyptic cool name to be the Trauma Nurse.
Ooh, yeah, I kind of like that.
And you'll be the Sidecar Kid.
Yeah, I still think we need to work on my name, but we haven't seen two other characters in this movie quite yet. I mean, we just heard the voice of Donald Pleasance as Prosser, but we haven't seen the leader of the group of the people that Ryder is helping out. And this is one of those names that I kind of have to scratch my head at. That guy's name is McWayne?
What are you getting at? What's the conundrum you're having?
Well, Prosser is weird enough, I guess. But it'd be so much better to have a name like Dr. Terminator or Professor Bad Guy or maybe Inspector Prosser? Yeah, Inspector Prosser. That seems like a lot more of a menacing name.
You know, Jeff...
What?
Dr. Evil could have worked too. It's like all of Donald Pleasance's characters in movies were the inspiration for Dr. Evil in the Austin Powers movies.
Check out that astute observation on the nurse over there. Donald Pleasance, who we talked about in pretty good detail a couple of years ago when we watched The Puma Man, played an important role in James Bond history. He became the first actor to portray Ernst Stavro Blofeld on screen, at least more than just a hand or an arm or a voice. And that came in 1967's You Only Live Twice. His attire in that film, his bald head and his scarred face, is indeed the inspiration for Mike Myers' Dr. Evil in the Austin Powers trilogy.
Ooh, if I'm the trauma nurse, why not call you the disorderly orderly?
I'm kind of digging that. I mean, but I'm already listed in the cast of our show as the Enema Man. Can I just do that?
I guess so. Anyway, Prosser does have a pretty kinky bondage rave bar at his fortress.
Oh, he sure does. Still, anything other than Prosser would be more menacing. Even if he was just labeled the dictator. I mean, that would have been enough. But that's not the worst, though. No, the worst is our idealistic leader of the rebellion setting out to take down Prosser, McWayne.
His name made me think that maybe McDonald's bought out and took over the town of Fort Wayne, Indiana, and changed its name.
Yeah, it kind of does, doesn't it? The name alone just is not inspiring. McWayne, I mean, he just sounds like a guy you know down the street who might know how to fix your riding mower when it isn't starting. We haven't even seen him yet in this movie, but he's played by a guy named Harrison Muller Sr. Now, Muller is kind of a nobody in terms of acting. This is the third and final credit to his name on IMDb. It's the only movie he ever actually appeared in. It seems as though he's actually a singer, but I'm always shocked to find out that he's virtually unknown because he looks like someone. I can never really put my finger on who he looks like or what I expect to have seen him in before, but he looks like someone I should know. Now, of course, MST3K kept calling him Jimmy Carter because he does kind of resemble the former president of the United States. But I wanted to talk about him because McWayne is the driving force of the first act of this movie. He's been captured by Prosser, and his daughter, Nastasia, needs the writer's help in saving him. Oh, and speaking of Nastasia, oh boy, do we have a significant person there.
Oh, I bet I know where this is going.
You're goddamn right you do. Nastasia is played by the persistent Persis Khambatta. Now, Khambatta was born in Bombay, India. After appearing in beauty pageants as a teen, she became a model. But before the end of that decade, Khambatta made her way into movies. But then, in the 70s, a role she will forever be known for came calling. Nurse, you know this thing called Star Trek?
Never heard of it.
As Star Trek was gaining more popularity in syndicated reruns than it ever had as a first-run television series, there was an attempt to revive the series as a new show called Star Trek Phase 2, and she was hired to play the bald Deltan navigator on the Enterprise named Ilia. This would eventually transform into the feature film Star Trek The Motion Picture, and as Ilia, Kambata was required to shave her head, and it nearly devastated her to watch her head be shaved down to the skin. But as Ilia, the new navigator of the newly refit Enterprise, then the even more alien probe sent by Seizure to gather information about the crew, she earned fame within a fandom that will never be forgotten. A couple of years later, with her hair grown back, she appeared in the Sylvester Stallone thriller Nighthawks, and then as Zara in the wonderfully campy Megaforce. Sadly, Kambata died very young. She was a chain smoker and went to a Mumbai hospital complaining of chest pains, and died at the age of 49 of a massive heart attack.
Ah, that's too bad.
Yes, it was. However, for a very brief and very specific period of time, she starred in movies that are still fondly remembered and watched to this day, and her natural beauty remains haunting in those movies.
Let's get back to the movie.
Yes, we need to get back to the movie and the big rescue of our great hero of all mankind, McWayne. Alright, let's talk about movie apocalypses. Apocalypse?
Apocalypagus?
Whatever, apocalypses. So the concept of telling stories about apocalyptic scenarios or post-apocalyptic life is about as old as civilization is for the human race. Apocalyptic literature dates back to as far as about 2000 BCE with writings from Sumerian myths and the Epic of Gilgamesh. Most people these days understand it in much more biblical terms, right? I mean, the Old Testament talks about this in terms of Sodom and Gomorrah. Even the Quran has references to that. However, we all know about the Christian concept of the Book of Revelations. It's about the final judgment of God, right? Well, honestly, that kind of heavily borrows from the concept of the Norse myth of Ragnarok. While I'm far from being a theologian, I can at least say that most religions have some sort of apocalyptic end-of-the-world concept.
It's like religions and myths require us to know there's an ending that we all have to be prepared for.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like the fear of the end has been bred into us in all societies and cultures since the dawn of religion, but I digress. In pop culture terms, the concept of what we think of as post-apocalyptic stories began in the 19th century. The likes of Lord Byron, Mary Shelley, Richard Jefferies, and Edgar Allan Poe wrote poems and stories about a world after the end of civilization. Naturally, though, perhaps the most influential science fiction writer, H.G. Wells, is the best of the 19th century writers covering end-of-world scenarios. The two most important works by him featuring this were The Time Machine in 1895, where humanity had evolved into two different species and civilization is gone. It even covers the concept of the sun itself expanding and dying. But then came 1898's The War of the Worlds, and in this story, Martians came to Earth to destroy humanity and take over the world for themselves. However, the only thing that actually saves humanity is the Martians' inability to acclimate to our atmosphere and the microbes that we have been acclimated to ourselves.
That's incredibly scientific. Wells was a smart dude.
Oh, for sure. Wells' understanding that our sun would expand and die out, becoming cooler and cooler and engulfing the planets closer to the star than we were, is incredible for someone who to have understood 130 years ago. Granted, it's likely common knowledge for those who had a grasp on astronomy or science at the time, but there are so freaking few people who understand that even today, and certainly back then. Then with the War of the Worlds, it is far more likely that we, like the Martians of that story, could never really land on another planet like in Star Trek or Star Wars and just exist on it without incredible danger for breathing or existing in that environment. That's incredibly aware of real science.
It's a bummer to think we can never go to another planet and meet aliens or vice versa. It sounds fun to have Star Wars or Star Trek and expand our understanding of other planets or beings firsthand.
Oh, believe me, my inner child is heartbroken over that fact.
Now I'm sad.
But let's talk about apocalyptic stories instead. That's somehow happier?
Now I'm scared that might be true.
And anyway, there are three primary categories of apocalyptic stories. First up, we have the science fiction-based apocalypse. These are your alien invasions, your AI or other technologies taking over, or something astronomical. And we've already talked about the alien invasion thing with the War of the Worlds. That's the quintessential alien invasion story. We are overmatched and utterly destroyed and scattered as a race, and therefore civilization cannot hold together properly. Similar but different are the astronomical threats. These are your passing asteroids, rogue planets, or changes to our solar system like the sun changes and cools or blows up or whatever. The Time Machine covers that to a certain extent, but think about things like Deep Impact or Armageddon from the late 90s. Armageddon diverts the potential disaster, but Deep Impact shows the apocalyptic effect of a comet striking Earth. But maybe the most clear and present concern in many people's mind in this category is the technological threat. 1984's The Terminator and the incredible 1991 sequel went deep into the danger of our own scientific advancements, basically replacing us as redundancies and threats to its own survival and evolution. The machines see us as a threat that must be eradicated, which overthrows governments, first by way of the machines destroying our infrastructure, and then hunting down the remnants of our species. And that leads us to 2024 and the fear of artificial intelligence.
Seems like every company in the world wants to know how to harness AI, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does. But here's the thing. We want it to have the ability to learn, but we also don't fully understand the rate in which it is learning and evolving. It's infiltrated art to many people's chagrin. It's giving answers and versions of truth and history framed from places that might not actually be the truth or true history. And it's kind of farming that kind of alternate history and mixing it in with what's real. You know, that's why you often hear about AI being scary, because it could lead, I guess, to the events of the Terminator.
Well, hopefully the machines realize that I'm not a real person, just a figment of your imagination represented by a cartoon.
Yeah.
So what's the second category of apocalyptic storytelling?
So the second category is what I would call the political category. This is mostly dominated by the concern of a world post-nuclear war or some other massively destructive conflict that would include the usage of bioweapons. The quintessential examples in pop culture of these things are the TV movies like The Day After from the United States, a movie so influential that it helped President Reagan realize that there needed to be some reining in of the nuclear proliferation by the superpowers of the world. And then the British film Threads. Both showed not just the fallout from a civilization standpoint, but also the fallout of radiation sickness and what it does to people and the world at large. Even Planet of the Apes and Star Trek have had instances in which their backstories dealt with a detrimental war that forced the rise of a new civilization after a period of decline in the previous one. Obviously, there are concerns about this in terms of rising tensions between places like NATO and Russia with their shenanigans in the Ukraine, and our ever-present tensions with countries like China and North Korea. But another situation that I place into this category is an apocalypse created by either struggling economic systems like a failing capitalist structure, which creates an imbalance in class structures, or loss of resources fit for the population within a country. These types of things are often shown as more dystopian scenarios rather than apocalypses. Think of something like A Clockwork Orange, Soylent Green, Blade Runner, and funnily enough, the Spielberg film AI. And our third and final category is the apocalypse created by nature. Now, science and politics can play into this as well, but this is a pretty big damn category. So big, in fact, that there are major subcategories in this overarching category itself. The first subcategory is the larger concept is a change in caused by natural resources. This could be a blight that affects our food sources. This was seen in Christopher Nolan's Interstellar. The most common thing, and something that is very much concerning us in the late 21st century, or in the early 21st century, is the combination of the loss of fossil fuels to power things. See things like Mad Max and the effects of our use of fuels that led to our messing up our own atmosphere. This is definitely also a Blade Runner thing. But also seen in movies like The Day After Tomorrow, which is all about climate change. The next subcategory, and one we know a whole lot about these days, is a pandemic. This could show up in different ways. Obviously, the most concerning is a pandemic that kills a significant portion of the world's population. I've heard that as little as 10% of the world's population dying quickly would upset the world a great deal. And I'm not talking about upsetting people in emotional sense, I mean like in structural sense. Even with the amount of deaths seen from the COVID-19 pandemic, the deaths were not quick and immediate. We were able to survive that, but it could have been a whole lot worse. This actually shows up a lot in comic books, but a very scary movie that delves into this concept was 1980's Virus, which was a Japanese movie but had an international cast. In a lesser note, but still something that created a dystopian situation that led to an apocalypse, the rise of the apes culture and Planet of the Apes franchise was due to a pandemic that killed off pretty much all the cats and dogs, so people took in apes as domesticated pets and trained them to be a slave race to serve humans. And of course that led to an uprising that led to a war. The absolute king subcategory of this larger concept for the better part of the last 55 years, though, is the zombie apocalypse. This was made popular by George A. Romero's seminal Night of the Living Dead, his own later films Dawn and Day of the Dead, along with the works of like 28 Days Later, and The Walking Dead kept revitalizing the genre and kept it going. Now we have The Last of Us, featuring a zombie apocalypse built around a fungal infection that takes over the brains of people and basically pilots their bodies.
I love zombie movies. They're pretty much all the same, but all scary and gross and fun.
Oh, for sure. And what's funny is that all of these apocalypses I've mentioned, the zombie apocalypse is likely the least possible one to occur. We will run out of fossil fuels if we keep using them the way we do. We do have an effect on our environment that's causing the world to continue to get hotter or and have effects on things like, with things like smog and just pollution in general. We could create a system that is so smart that it goes rogue and decides that we are the greatest threat to the world and wipe us out. We could get hit by a comet that wasn't diverted by either Jupiter or the sun's gravitational wells. We could have our own sun expand and make life hard for us. We could have a disease rip through people at a rate that we can't stop. We could kill ourselves with nuclear war. We have the means for that. It's even possible that an alien race with malicious intent comes to Earth and wipes us out for whatever reason. There seems to be no situation or math for a zombie apocalypse though, so feel better about that, I guess.
Well, I'm glad you were able to cool my concerns over how a bunch of zombies could come along and either infect us or eat us for dinner.
But you're not worried about the stuff that is far more likely to happen?
Nah, we all gotta go sometime.
Huh. Okay, well, let's get back to the exciting conclusion of Warrior of the Lost World. Alright, that was Warrior of the Lost World. That Prosser fella sure was a slippery fuck in the end, huh? Yeah, you can say that again, Poop Shoot. I also like that there was a sequel setup that never came to fruition.
So, what was Prosser's thing?
Well, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, I get that he was the leader of one of these civilizations that rose from the apocalypse. And I certainly understand the Big Brother style of always telling people propaganda as they went about their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I think I know where you're going with this.
So does everyone that Prosser controls live in that one building? Is it just that one compound, or are there borders that he holds claim to?
I mean, I have to assume that there is some sort of a border situation here. I mean, that's why Prosser's people roam the streets and attack people like the Rider at the beginning of the movie.
But maybe they live inside the big compound?
I don't know, probably.
Okay, but then it seems like some people are like mind-controlled drones or something. He did that to the chick. Said he was going to plug her into a computer?
Yeah, I don't quite understand that other than, I mean, I feel like they were working backwards from the final moments of the movie, maybe.
What do you mean?
I know where you're going with this, and I think I can kind of sum it up based on what I think. How's that sound?
Hit me with it, Doc.
Okay, so The thing is about this movie is that I feel like David Worth was hired to give the production company a Mad Max-like post-apocalyptic movie. But to differentiate it from Mad Max, he pulled in all these other elements. Absolutely, the chase at the beginning was Mad Max. But then, when he went dick first into that cliff and was deemed worthy enough to pass into that weird setting with the mutant people, that comes across to me a little bit more like a Zardoz sort of situation.
Is that a good idea to borrow from Zardoz?
Not especially, but it's the first thing I thought of when these elders very clearly had those special powers to heal him. But immediately following that, we have the resistance thing. So we're kind of back to the typical post-apocalyptic / dystopian story. But later, that's additionally added onto when McWayne and Ryder go off to build their resistance force from the weirdos out in the wilds. But it's the Prosser stuff that feels like a totally different movie.
Yeah, it does seem like a different movie. Just a lot of stuff in this kitchen sink.
I mean, maybe that came from another idea that David Worth had, but it feels more like a story that is about suppression of free will and expression, and then having the propaganda lie to the people about their value and their place in the society. That's a whole different style of dystopian science fiction. But then to add to it an entire process for Prosser to completely and totally wipe out someone's free will using techniques and machines, then plug them into a computer console. I mean, that's obviously some sort of comment on people being, cogs in a wheel that sucks you dry. There is something more to say about that whole part that I don't have a whole lot of time to do, but suffice it to say, this feels like a completely different movie in concept than the rest of the movie. For Prosser to also have a decoy robot version of himself is extra sci-fi elements that probably don't really fit what we're actually seeing in this society, but whatever. It's just weird that we've seen 2 Donald Pleasance movies on this show, and both of them feature him attempting to control people's minds for his own nefarious plans, which include betraying our hero characters. Hey, looks like Poop Shoot wants to hear your final thoughts, Nurse.
You got it, PC. This movie is pretty darn goofy. It starts kind of strong with the wall of text that I wanted to do a cool narrator voice for, but quickly ran out of breath with how fast the information was being thrown at me. Also, that's a lot of information to try and set up this world. But then we got that Mad Max style opening. That was pretty alright if you ask me. But you know what? The goofiness and the cheapness really began to show through. The sound effects were silly, like a bunch of lasers firing off that sounded like someone was blubbering their lips. The costumes are kind of silly. I like the different people they have to go and bring together to fight Prosser, but I don't know if I liked it because they were all these different types of gangs, or if I liked it because it was pretty silly. But oh man, everyone who busted into the compound to save both McWayne and then later his daughter had to be some of the luckiest people on Earth. Or Prosser's goons need to take more shooting practice because they totally sucked at aiming. They tried with their Mad Max ripoff, but at the end of the day, this is average at best. I give this 3 poops out of 5. Back to you, Jeff.
And there we have it. By the way, one of the featured Amazon characters that helps free nostalgia is Greta Garetta, one of Italy's most frequently cast tough gals in their movies. Always glad to see her in one of these 80s genre films. So, that brings us to the end of this week's episode of B-Movie Enema, the series. That over there is Nurse Disembodied. This under here is the great B-Movie Poop Shoot, and I have been Jeff Arbuckle, your friendly neighborhood road warrior and Enema Man, bidding you all a good evening. What do we got here? Huh. Hey, Nurse, check it out. There's a new club in town, and this is a personal invite from the owner who just moved into this area. Let's see here. Let's see what it says. Relax and enjoy the entertainment provided. You are allowed to enjoy the video and visceral process. Oh, that's nice of him. Ponder if the meek are inheriting the earth when you are given access to Prosser's leather bar. Please attend and get funky. Hey, that doesn't sound too bad. Let's get our leather out of the closet, Nurse, and hey man, let's get weird.